My company fired me because of my sister. But what they didn't know was that I secretly owned everything they had worked for. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Ethan Miller. I'm in my late 20s and for years I worked at a mid-sized construction and development company. I wasn't the smartest guy in the room, but I was one of the hardest workers. I showed up early, stayed late, and made sure the job got done. The company became a second home to me. My boss, Richard Hayes, used to pat me on the back, tell me I was like family. I believed him. I thought the people I worked with were my brothers. Family has always meant everything to me, and the person I love most is my younger sister, Grace. She's in college, working part-time, and I've always tried to protect her. She's the kind of girl who carries a smile everywhere she goes, no matter how hard things get. When she asked if she could pick up some extra hours at the company, I didn't hesitate. I put in a word with Richard and soon she was working there too. I felt proud watching her walk into the same office where I had built my life. At first, everything seemed fine. Grace worked hard just like I did. She filed paperwork, answered phones, helped out wherever she could. But I noticed the way Mark, Richard's son, looked at her. Mark was the kind of guy who never had to earn anything. He was spoiled, arrogant, and mean when he didn't get his way. Grace brushed off his comments at first, but they got worse. He started making jokes that weren't funny, getting too close, acting like she owed him something just because of who his father was. One night Grace came home in tears. She told me Mark wouldn't leave her alone. She said he'd cornered her and told her she'd better be nicer to him if she wanted to keep her job. I saw the fear in her eyes and it broke something inside me. The next day I confronted Mark at the office. I didn't raise my voice, but I made it clear he had to back off. He smirked and said I didn't know who I was talking to. I thought Richard would do the right thing, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of calling his son out, Richard called me and Grace into his office. He didn't even let us explain. He said we were bringing drama into the workplace, that we were making his son uncomfortable. And then just like that he fired us both. I can't explain how it felt. Humiliation. Rage. Betrayal. I had given years of my life to this company, trusted these people, and they threw me out like I was nothing. My coworkers, the same guys I'd shared lunches and late nights with, looked away. Not one of them spoke up for me or for Grace. Grace blamed herself. She cried and said if she hadn't taken the job, none of this would have happened. I held her and told her the truth. It wasn't her fault. It was them. Richard. Mark. Everyone who stood by in silence. What they didn't know was that this wasn't the end of my story. I had other ties to this company, ties I'd kept quiet about for years. And the same people who fired me would soon find out that I wasn't just another employee. Grace started her part-time position with the kind of focus I always admired in her. She arrived early, dressed neat, and carried herself with quiet confidence. Everyone noticed how quickly she picked things up. She asked questions when she didn't know something and never shied away from helping anyone who needed a hand. It felt good watching her earn respect on her own. But there was one person who didn't see her hard work, Mark Hayes. He held the title of junior manager, though everyone knew it came from his father. Mark wasn't used to people telling him no, and when Grace kept her distance from him, it bruised his ego. He started lingering by her desk too long, inventing excuses to call her into his office. She told him politely she was there to work, but that only pushed him to test her more. His remarks carried less subtlety each day until finally she told him to stop. Grace didn't let herself be intimidated, and that refusal lit a fire in him. Soon after, whispers began circulating that she wasn't as professional as she appeared. Mark claimed she spoke to him with disrespect and failed to follow instructions. He painted her as difficult, the type of employee who caused problems instead of solving them. It didn't take long before Richard called her in. He didn't ask questions, didn't check with anyone else. He stood firm beside his son, convinced Grace had stepped out of line. The weight of Mark's words mattered more to him than the work she had already proven. I couldn't stay quiet. When I heard what had been said, I spoke up in front of the entire office. My voice carried across the room and every head turned. I laid out exactly how Grace had acted with integrity from day one. I called out the lies for what they were and made it clear she didn't deserve to be treated that way. The silence that followed was heavy. My coworkers froze, stunned that I had confronted the Hayes family so openly. Some of them looked worried, others almost relieved, but none dared to add a word. The air between us all shifted, and from that moment, a line had been drawn between my loyalty to my sister and Richard's devotion to his son. Richard asked me to step into his office late in the afternoon. The blinds were drawn and the air felt tight. Mark was already there, sitting back with a smug grin like he'd been waiting for the show to start. I didn't even get the chance to sit before Richard started speaking. His words cut sharp. He said I'd crossed the line, that by standing up for Grace I had created a hostile environment. He accused me of dragging personal problems into the workplace, claiming my behavior was disruptive. I looked from one to the other, searching for some trace of reason, but all I saw was a father covering for his son. Richard's tone left no space for argument. He leaned forward, his voice cold and final, and said, "You and your sister are liabilities. You're both fired." For a moment I couldn't move. The floor felt like it tilted under me. Years of effort, all the late nights, every sacrifice I'd made, it vanished with a single sentence. Mark smirked, and Richard folded his hands like the matter was settled. When I stepped back into the main office, faces turned toward me, then quickly away. Men I'd eaten lunch with, people who once called me a friend, now couldn't look me in the eye. Their silence stung worse than Richard's words. Not one of them spoke up. Not one of them even nodded in my direction. I felt stripped bare, as though I'd been erased right there in front of everyone. Grace waited by the door, her hands twisting together. When I told her, she crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered that it was all her fault. She said if she hadn't been there, none of this would have happened. Her guilt poured out and it broke me to hear it. I pulled her close and told her the truth. It wasn't on her shoulders. The blame sat squarely on Richard and Mark, not on her. She tried to argue, but I wouldn't let her carry that weight. I told her again and again that none of this was her doing. We gathered our things in silence. Every step toward the exit felt heavier, like chains tightening around my chest. When we reached the door, I turned back one last time. No one moved. No one spoke. The same people I'd stood beside for years had chosen silence over loyalty. As I walked out with Grace by my side, a fire lit inside me. The illusion that I had been part of a family there shattered completely. Richard and Mark had never seen me as anything more than disposable. That day, humiliation hardened into something sharper. I knew this wasn't the end, because they had no idea who they had just pushed out. Long before I ever set foot in that office, my life had already been shaped by a man who believed in me more than anyone else. My grandfather. He was quiet, steady, and sharp as steel even in his old age. Most people in town never realized how deep his ties ran, but he'd been backing businesses for decades, slipping behind the scenes while others took the spotlight. When he passed, he left me with more than memories. The will was simple but weighty. He had arranged his investments so they would eventually fall into my hands. Among them was a controlling interest in the very company where I would later build my career. At the time, the number startled me. 51%. Enough to dictate the direction of the business outright. Enough to decide who sat in power and who didn't. It wasn't just money, it was influence woven into contracts, shares, and signatures. I could have walked into the building years ago with that fact pinned to my chest like a badge. I could have demanded an office with my name on the door and watched everyone bow their heads. But that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to understand what it meant to build something from the ground up, to see the sweat and grit that held a company together. I didn't want respect bought. I wanted it earned. So I kept the papers tucked away. I showed up like any other new hire, starting small, learning every corner of the work. I swung hammers, checked blueprints, stayed late on site. Nobody knew the truth except the lawyer who had handled my grandfather's estate. Every time Richard shook my hand and told me how valuable I was to him, I thought about the files sitting locked away. Every time Mark strutted through the office acting untouchable, I thought about the signatures tying his future to me. I carried the secret alone, never hinting, never bragging. Silence gave me the freedom to see the company for what it truly was, stripped of any false courtesy. I told myself I would keep it that way until the moment came when I truly needed it. That moment arrived the day Richard cast me out. The humiliation clung to my skin, but underneath it, something colder moved. They believed they had shut the door on me. They believed their decision was final. What they didn't realize was that I still held the keys, the kind that couldn't be taken away with a few angry words. I opened the old file box that night. The papers were yellowed at the edges, but the ink was as strong as the day it was written. Deeds, transfer forms, stock certificates, all bearing my name. Every page was a reminder of the foresight my grandfather had trusted me with. For years I had kept this power hidden, but betrayal has a way of burning away restraint. They thought they had silenced me. They thought they had buried my place in the company. But with those documents in my hands, I knew the truth. I had never really left. The morning after I read through the papers, I picked up the phone and began dialing numbers I had never once used in all my years at the company. Mark was already there. Names that had only existed to me like signatures on memos now answered my calls directly. I didn't even get the chance to sit myself not as an employee but as the primary shareholder. Cut sharp, and the tone on the other end of the line shifted by standing up for Grace. Some paused in disbelief, some let out a low chuckle of relief. He accused me of dragging personal problems into the workplace, unusual about claiming my behavior was disruptive. One thing became clear during one to the other, searching for some trace of reason, seated at his own table. All I saw was a father and women who nodded in meetings and Richard's tone left no space for argument. But he leaned forward, his voice cold and final, and said, how his son's antics had embarrassed the company more than once. You're both fired. How his temper had pushed for a moment I couldn't move. My voice gave them permission to admit what they had swallowed years of effort, all the late end of the day, every sacrifice I'd made. I called for a shareholder meeting, citing my right as majority holder. Richard folded his hands. The notice went out formally with my signature stamped back into the main office. It was a short line of then quickly away, but it carried the weight of law. Then I'd eaten lunch with people who once called me a friend. Now couldn't look me in the eye. When the appointed morning arrived, their silence stung worse than Richard's words. Not one of them filled the chairs, papers rustled, not one of them even nodded in my direction. Conversations buzzed low until I'd been erased right there in front of everyone. Richard entered first. Grace waited by the door, his expression painted with smug certainty. When I told her, she crumbled, followed, adjusting his tie, down her wearing face the same grin that it was all the day I was dismissed. She said if she hadn't been the stage, none of this would have happened. Then I stepped through the opposite door. Her guilt poured out, and it broke me to hear it as I crossed the carpet. I pulled her close and told her the truth. It wasn't on her shoulders. Chairs shifted. The blame sat squarely on Richard mid-sentence, his mouth parting without sound. She tried to argue, but I wouldn't let her carry that weight. A ghost. I told her again and again that none of this was her doing. I simply pulled the folder from my hand and set it on the table where everyone felt heavier, like chains tightening around my chest. The proof of authority that none of them could deny. Then I looked directly at Richard and no one spoke. You fired me from my job. I'd stood beside for years had chosen silence over loyalty. But you forgot one thing. As I walked out with Grace by my side, the silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever heard in that building. The illusion that I had been part of a family there shattered completely. It stretched across the room. Richard and Mark had never seen me as anything more than disposable. Some of the board members leaned back with small smiles creeping onto their faces, as though they had been waiting for this day, because they had no idea who they had just waiting for him to answer. Long before I ever set foot in that office, Mark's grin slipped away. My life had already been shaped by a man who believed in me more than anyone else. On the table. My grandfather. Richard's face turned red. He was quiet, his eyes darting from the documents even to the men and women who had once most people in town never realized how deep his ties ran. For him, but he'd been back in business for decades. In that moment, the behind the scenes while others took the spotlight. The man who had believed himself untouchable left me with more than memories. While I stood exactly where I was always meant to be. He had arranged his investments no longer they would eventually fall into my hands. The room understood it all at once. Among them was a controlling interest in the very company where I would later build my career. Shattering at the time, the number startled me. Over the table. 51%. He slammed his palm against the wood, to dictate the direction of the business outright. Enough demands to spilled out of him in a storm. He wanted to know how this was possible, who had allowed it, what game woven into contracts, shares, and signatures. His fury bounced from wall to wall. I could have walked into the building years ago with that fact pinned to my chest like a badge. Instead, all eyes turned toward the chair at the end of the table. I could have demanded an office with my name on the door and watched everyone bow their heads. The documents showed. But that wasn't what I wanted. The shares were in my name. I wanted to understand what it meant to build something from the ground up. To see the sweat and grit that held a company together, so that no one mistook my intention. Richard no longer held the office he had abused. So I kept the papers tucked away. Effective immediately, I showed up like any other new hire, starting small, the words landed like a gavel corner of the work. Final and unshakable. I swung hammers, checked blueprints. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't look larger than life. Nobody knew the truth except the lawyer who had handled my grandfather's estate. Mark tried to cut through the tension every time Richard shook my hand and told me how valuable I was to him, waving a hand as though the room would agree with him if he made light of it. Every time Mark strutted through the office acting untouchable, I reached into my folder again and slid a separate file across the polished wood. I carried the secret inside were detailed accounts, statements, and records of his behavior. Gave me the freedom to see the company for what it truly laid bare his actions, stripped of any false notes courtesy. From staff, copies I told of myself I would keep it that way until the moment came when I'd been too scared to voice until now. That moment arrived the day Richard papers filled the silence. The humiliation clung to my skin, but reading line after line, something colder moved. Gasps and mutters. They believed they had shut the door on me. The smirk on Mark's face drained away until he sat stiff. What they didn't realize was that I still held the keys. The kind that couldn't be taken away lifted her angry words. Her eyes glistened, opened the old file box that night. This time it was the relief of finally being believed. But the ink was as strong as the day crushed her name had been stripped away. Transfer forms stood in plain sight. Stock certificates, I addressed the room, not just Richard and his son. Every page was a reminder of the accountability my grandfather had trusted me with, of the duty owed to every worker whose effort built the company brick by brick. But betrayal has a way of burning away restraint. Then I turned to the matter of leadership. They thought they had silenced me. The seat of chief executive they thought could they not had buried my place in the company, but it also could not belong to me. But with those documents in my hands, I already held the reins in another way. I had never really left. What the company needed was steady hands, someone who commanded respect through experience and integrity. My choice was clear. Caroline West, a long-standing board member with decades of industry knowledge, had the qualities Richard never possessed. I put her name forward, and the nods around the table followed without hesitation. She accepted with quiet dignity, offering me a small glance that said more than words ever could. Respect, trust, partnership. Those were the pillars I wanted the future built on. Richard slumped back in his chair, his face pale beneath the anger. Mark's jaw clenched, but he had no argument left. For the first time they both felt the weight of loss. Not just a title or a paycheck, but the empire they had thought untouchable. In the span of a single meeting, everything had slipped from their grasp. The morning after I read Richard sitting in his place on the phone and began dialing lines I had never once used in all my years at the company. Mark was already names that had only existed to me as signatures on memos that now answered my calls directly. I didn't even get the chance to introduce myself not as an employee but as the primary shareholder. Every eye watching, and the tone at the other end of the line shifted. No words of comfort met. Some paused and created a hostile environment. Some let out a low chuckle. He accused me of more than one admitted they had picture of a man carrying claiming my behavior was disruptive. One thing became clear during one to the other. The evidence against him was read into the round table, all I saw leaving no other women who nodded in meetings. His Richard's tone left no space for argument, stamped into company records before he could utter a defense. They confessed how his son's antics had embarrassed the company more than glaring at anyone how his temper had pushed for a moment a dismissal letter in front of him. My voice gave them like it tilted under all his swagger. Years of title dissolved by the end of the day. Every sacrifice the formalities, I caught them a shareholder sentence, citing my right as majority Richard. The buzz of his notice went out formally with my signature. When I stepped back into the main office, it was a short demanding they hold their heads high the weight of then I'd eaten lunch. There was no way who once stepped closer, lowering my voice when the appointed morning arrived. Their silence stuck between Richard's words. I told no one of them and unshaken. Papers rustled, the coffee cups sounded everything feels like. Conversations buzzed low until I been racing right there in front of everyone. Richard entered first, race waited by the door. His expression was fight left to win. When I told her she walked toward the exit, their stems down her face, she whispered that it was the empire they believed untouchable. She had they owned the stage. None of this would they carried nothing out of that building but poured out. My footsteps as I returned to the floor. I felt her close and told her the truth. People who had once on her shoulders now approached. The blame sat squarely on his mid-sentence. Others spoke quietly. She tried confessing what they had held back like he had seen a ghost. They admitted they had despised Richard's favoritism doing. How promotions and opportunities were handed to Mark set every step towards everyone felt heavier. Many said they had wanted to change my name. Knew it would cost them the door. I turned them one after another. They came no one directly at Richard and no one spoke. You fired away from my buried under Richard's rules that had chosen silence over loyalty. Their voices were cautious. As I walked out with grace by my side, the fire lit followed was heavier than any illusion that I had been part of my family there stretched across the room. Each of them down realizing never seen just my victory. Some of the board members leaned back with Richard and Mark had hardened on fear and favoritism, and now that it had been waiting for this day, because they had no idea who they had just. The company felt like it belonged to before I ever set foot in that office. Mark's grin, the first day had already been shaped by his jaw clearing his more than twitched on the table. My grandfather's face turned red. The air was heavy, eyes darting from the document. People glanced over their shoulders. Most people in town never realized how deep his ties spoke for him. But he'd been knocking buildings for take more than a title. In that slipping behind needed action, not the man who had believed himself. I began by opening my door to anyone who wanted to speak. The role was simple secretary's project. He had arranged his was no longer voices that had been long understood and all at once. Among them was a controlling unfair treatment in the very company Richard's would later brag how fear had kept shattering time the number started. I didn't interrupt. 51%. He slammed his palm against the wood. Some direction of tears in his eyes. Relieved enough to decide build out of him. That was the start of wanted to know how this was possible. The next step was allowed influence woven into contracts. Power had been used as a shield to wall. I could have walked into the building years ago with that fact. Instead, my eyes turned toward the chair. I could have demanded an office with the lead director on the door. No longer what the documents showed. But that wasn't what what shares were investigated. I wanted to understand what it meant to build something from training sessions were held. To see this not as a formality but evenly so that no one must be my foundation moving forward. Richard no longer held the office. So I kept the papers tucked away. Immediately, I showed up when everyone saw that this wasn't starting small. Landed like a gavel corner of the work. Final and I sat in on one of those blueprints. For the first time afterward, I asked her if she wanted to know the truth except her lawyers who had handled my reputation. Tried to cut through the tension. Every time Richard shook my hand and told me how valuable I was to him, shook her head, thought about the files sitting locked away him if he made every time wanted to build her had been waiting her own way. Untouchable. I reached into my folder again and slid a separate file. The door would always be carried the secret inside were detailed accounts through the building felt different records of his behavior towards the company. Every page laid bare his stripped of any false courtesy. Some copies I told myself I would keep it that way until the moment the look in their eyes scared me the truth. That moment arrived about the shares I held or the authority. Humiliation clung to my about how I treated line after line. Something colder as human beings who believed they had shut the door. There was no more whisper beliefs their decision was no more favoritism. What they didn't realize was that I still held emotions began to refine that couldn't taken away. Lifted her chin. Ideas flowed from I opened the old file for the first time in years. This time it was the relief to finally change the course of the project. The ink was as strong that had rushed her name had been stripped away. The company didn't just function in plain sight. Stock certificates. I realized not just leadership and every page was a reminder of the accountability people entrusted me with. Of the duty was about every work of day by day the company. But betrayal has a way of burning the matter when expected. They thought they had that was the legacy I wanted. They had buried my place in the company, but it also could not for everyone who had endured this. I already held the reins in another way. I had never really left. What the company needed was steady hands. Someone who commanded respect through experience and integrity. My choice was clear. Caroline West, a long-standing board member with decades of industry knowledge, had the qualities Richard never possessed. I put her name forward, and the nods around the table followed without hesitation. She accepted with quiet dignity, offering me a small glance that said more than words ever could. Respect, trust, partnership, those were the pillars I wanted the future built on. Richard slumped back in his chair, his face pale beneath the anger. Mark's jaw clenched, but he had no argument left. For the first time they both felt the weight of loss. Not just a title or a paycheck but the empire they had thought untouchable. In the span of a single meeting, everything had slipped from their grasp. Weeks passed and the company began to find its rhythm again. One evening as I stepped out of the building, I caught sight of a familiar figure waiting by the sidewalk. Richard stood there, shoulders slumped, a man who no longer carried the weight of authority but the heaviness of loss. He approached me quickly, his tone stripped of pride. He asked for a chance to make things right, for an opportunity to return in some capacity. His words carried desperation, not command. I let him speak until his pleas trailed off, then I answered plainly. You lost your company the day you chose to protect your son's lies instead of the truth. The sentence landed between us like a door closing. His eyes dropped, and for the first time I saw him not as a towering figure but as a man who had gambled everything and lost. Before he could respond, another voice cut in. Mark stepped out from behind the corner, his posture rigid, his expression hard. Bitterness twisted his face as he squared up to me. He tried to rattle me with threats, hinting that I'd regret what I'd done to their family. He leaned closer, attempting to intimidate me with the same arrogance he once wore in the office halls. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or step back. I simply looked him in the eye and brushed past him as if his words meant nothing, because they did. The authority he once wielded was gone. The protection he had always relied on had vanished, and he knew it. His silence as I walked away said more than any outburst could have. As I left them behind, I understood that this wasn't only about what had been taken from me. It wasn't even about the revenge they believed I'd claimed. It was about my sister, about making sure her dignity had been defended, and about ensuring no one else would suffer under the same abuse of power. This fight had been personal, but its outcome was larger than us. The company was free of their shadow, and Grace could move forward without the stain of their lies. Looking back, the path felt unreal at times, as if it belonged to someone else. One moment I believed I was part of a family built on loyalty, and the next I was standing outside with nothing but the sting of betrayal. The people I trusted turned their backs, and the ground I thought was steady collapsed beneath me. Humiliation carved itself deep into me, but it didn't break me. It lit a fire I hadn't known I carried. That fire led me into the place I had always been destined to stand. The role I once avoided became the role I embraced, not out of greed but out of necessity. Owning the company had never been about the money or the title. It was about making sure those who worked honestly could hold their heads high. It was about ensuring no one else would face what Grace had faced. I saw the shift most clearly when I walked through the halls and caught genuine smiles from people who had once kept quiet under fear. Respect was no longer something demanded. It was something given freely. The work carried meaning again, and I knew I had stepped fully into the position my grandfather had believed I was capable of carrying. Grace stood at my side through every turn. I thought about the nights she cried, the days she doubted herself, and the strength it took for her to keep moving despite it all. Pride filled me when I looked at her. She hadn't just survived what they threw at her. She came out of it with her spirit intact. She chose her own path forward, and I admired that more than anything I had achieved. The betrayal that once threatened to crush us instead became the spark that changed everything. What Richard and Mark had tried to use to destroy us ended up revealing the truth they never saw coming. They believed they had silenced me, but they had only unlocked the strength I'd kept hidden. In the end, I didn't just reclaim what was mine. I proved that loyalty and integrity mattered more than empty power. And when I thought about how far we had come, I knew the truth of it all rested in a single line. They fired me for my sister, but in the end it was for her that I took back everything they thought they owned. Do you think I made the right choice standing my ground, or should I have let them back in? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe and stay tuned for more.